The air in the 40th floor executive boardroom was suffocating, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and $50 million steaks. I was on my knees in a faded maintenance uniform, quietly rewiring the main projector beneath the massive mahogany table. Suddenly, the tense silence was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched beep beep beep. It was my watch, a cheap, brightly colored plastic superhero watch with a jagged crack straight across the face. Trent, the arrogant project manager, let out a loud, mocking snort. At the head of the table, Sloane, the untouchable CEO, froze. She slowly lowered her presentation remote. Her wrist glittered with a flawless $50,000 Patek Philippe. She glared down at my plastic watch with a look of absolute, unfiltered disgust. A man wearing a $5 piece of trash has no right to breathe the same air in my $50 million boardroom? She snapped, her voice like cracking ice. You are fired. Get out. I didn't argue or beg for my job. I simply lifted my hand, protectively covering the cracked plastic face of the watch so they couldn't look at it anymore. I locked eyes with the billionaire CEO, giving her a dead, chilling stare that made her flinch before I turned my back and walked out the heavy glass doors. Before we witness the heartbreaking truth that will force this arrogant CEO to burst into tears, tell me what state or country you are watching from in the comments below. Your comment helps our stories reach more people. And if you love emotional stories about karma and family, don't forget to like and subscribe. I carried a small, battered cardboard box containing 3 years of my life out through the revolving glass doors of the towering corporate headquarters. The freezing autumn wind bit at my face, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the absolute, suffocating arrogance I had just left behind in that boardroom. I walked the 6 blocks to the local elementary school, arriving just as the final bell echoed across the concrete courtyard. A sea of children flooded out, and within seconds, a small, familiar force crashed into my legs. "Dad!" Leo beamed, looking up at me with a missing front tooth and eyes that were the exact shade of his mother's. He immediately grabbed my hand, his small fingers brushing against the bright red, cracked plastic superhero watch strapped to my wrist. "It beeped today, right?" he asked with absolute seriousness. "Right on time, buddy," I said softly, adjusting his backpack. To Sloane and her room full of venture capitalists, this watch was a $5 piece of trash, an eyesore, a pathetic joke that offended their expensive tastes. But they didn't know the story carved into its shattered plastic face. 4 years ago, my wife Elena had bought this cheap toy watch from a gas station on her way home from work. It was meant to be a surprise for Leo's 3rd birthday. She never made it home. A drunk driver ran a red light at 70 miles an hour, crushing her sedan into unrecognizable metal. The watch was recovered from the wreckage, its face deeply cracked by the violent impact. The alarm that had so deeply offended the billionaire CEO was set to exactly 3:15 p.m., the precise, agonizing minute. The trauma surgeon stepped into the waiting room and told me Elena's heart had permanently stopped. It was a cruel, devastating daily reminder and a sacred vow I made to myself that I would never, ever be late to pick up our son. I wasn't always the invisible maintenance man crawling under boardroom tables. A lifetime ago, I was a pioneering micromechanical engineer. I designed high-precision calibration systems for advanced medical equipment. I held patents that generated millions. But the corporate grind demanded 80-hour work weeks, endless flights, and a soul entirely devoted to the company. When Elena died, I realized all the prestige and wealth in the world couldn't buy me one extra second with her, and it certainly couldn't be a father to a grieving little boy. So I walked away. I abandoned the laboratories and the massive salaries, taking a bottom-tier maintenance job just so I could clock out at exactly 3 o'clock every single day. Now, looking down at Leo's innocent smile, a bitter knot tightened painfully in my chest. I had willingly swallowed my pride and accepted a life in the shadows to protect him. And today, I had lost our only source of income because a billionaire decided the heavy, heartbreaking weight of my grief wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for her boardroom. I was standing by the service elevators, balancing a battered cardboard box of my tools on my hip while waiting for the heavy steel doors to open. Through the sprawling, floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the executive testing lab, I had a perfect view of Sloane's $50 million presentation reaching its climax. In the center of the room sat a transparent isolation chamber holding the company's crown jewel, a revolutionary micromechanical calibration device designed specifically for pediatric heart surgeries. It was a piece of technology that could save thousands of fragile lives. Sloane was speaking with absolute, untouchable confidence, gesturing gracefully toward the lead investor, an imposing, silver-haired man whose checkbook controlled the fate of her entire empire. Trent stood by the main control console, adjusting his expensive silk tie and smirking with that same unearned arrogance he had shown me minutes earlier. On Sloane's cue, he confidently pressed the primary ignition sequence. For exactly 12 seconds, the machine hummed with a beautiful, flawless, high-frequency vibration. Then, a sickening, violent, metallic screech echoed through the thick architectural glass. A thin wisp of acrid black smoke curled inside the pristine isolation chamber. The main rotational axis locked up with a brutal shudder, sparking brightly as the internal gears ground against each other in a catastrophic jam. The high-pitched warning alarms immediately began shrieking. Trent's smug, arrogant composure instantly vanished, evaporating into sheer, suffocating panic. He scrambled backward, then frantically started slamming his perfectly manicured fingers against the control board. I could read his panicked lips as he shouted over the alarms, desperately blaming the software, a power surge, and even the maintenance staff for the sudden failure. But I didn't need to look at a computer diagnostic screen to know exactly what had just happened. My ear had been trained for over a decade to recognize the precise acoustic signature of failing micromechanics. The grinding pitch was unmistakable. Trent hadn't just made a simple programming error. The corrupt project manager had secretly swapped out the thermal-resistant, aerospace-grade tungsten gears for cheap, substandard aluminum alloys, undoubtedly pocketing millions of dollars from the R&D budget for himself. Under the intense friction and heat of a live maximum capacity stress test, those cheap metals had suffered severe thermal expansion. They had warped, swollen, and completely destroyed the microscopic synchronization of the entire system. Inside the boardroom, the disaster was absolute. The lead investor's face twisted in profound disgust. He coldly snapped his leather briefcase shut, shaking his head. Even through the heavy glass, his verdict was incredibly clear. We are done here. The $50 million is off the table. He turned his back on the chaotic room and headed straight for the exit. Sloane stood completely frozen. The untouchable billionaire, the woman who had just violently ridiculed the most sacred piece of plastic I owned, looked utterly hollowed out. Her pristine, icy posture collapsed as she helplessly watched her life's work, her entire corporate legacy, burn to the ground in a cloud of cheap, toxic smoke. I stood in the freezing parking lot, the bitter wind biting at my face, my hand tightly holding Leo's. Through the massive ground floor windows of the testing lab, I could see the absolute chaos unfolding. The lead investor was walking out, his checkbook firmly closed. Sloane was frozen in shock, her untouchable aura entirely shattered. Trent was frantically hammering at the control console, trying desperately to hide his sabotage as the prototype spewed acrid black smoke into the isolation chamber. All I had to do was keep walking. I could put my son in my rusted car, drive away, and let Sloane's $50 million empire crumble into ashes. She had humiliated me in front of her executives. She had looked at the most sacred piece of plastic I owned and called it trash. A dark, bitter part of my soul deeply wanted to watch her burn. But then my eyes shifted past the panicked CEO and locked onto the smoking machine. The prototype inside wasn't just a piece of corporate hardware. It was a high-precision, micromechanical pediatric heart valve calibrator. It was the exact theoretical technology I had spent my former career trying to perfect. More importantly, it was the exact medical technology that had it been completed 4 years earlier, could have stabilized Elena's failing heart after the crash. I looked down at the cracked superhero watch on my wrist. I looked at Leo's innocent, trusting eyes. If I walked away now out of spite, Trent would escape with millions in stolen R&D funds, and a device that could save thousands of grieving families would be permanently scrapped. My wounded pride wasn't worth another child losing their mother. Hey, buddy, I crouched down, looking Leo in the eye. I need you to go sit with Stan at the security desk for just a few minutes, okay? Can you do that for me? Leo nodded seriously, taking his backpack and jogging over to the friendly guard we saw every day. Once he was safely behind the desk, I turned back toward the lab. I didn't knock. I hit the heavy glass double doors with my shoulder, bursting into the room like a wrecking ball. "What are you doing in here?" Sloane screamed, her voice pitching into absolute hysteria when she saw my faded maintenance uniform. "I fired you. Security. Get this trash out of my lab right now." I didn't even look at the billionaire. I dropped my cardboard box of personal items onto the immaculate floor and walked straight toward the isolation chamber. Trent stepped in my way, his face red with panic and manufactured rage. "Back off, you filthy mechanic." I grabbed Trent by the expensive lapels of his tailored suit and violently shoved him backward. He stumbled and crashed into the mahogany briefing table, knocking over a tray of crystal water glasses. Ignoring the shrieking system alarms, I reached directly into the smoking chamber. For 3 years, I had hidden my brilliance behind a wrench and a mop. But the moment my calloused, grease-stained fingers touched the burning metal casing of the prototype, the clumsy maintenance worker vanished. My hands remembered the language of micromechanics. With a terrifying, fluid precision that made the entire room gasp, I bypassed the jammed electronic safety locks and began to manually disassemble the incredibly complex microgears with my bare hands. I didn't need computer diagnostics. I needed a single millimeter precision screwdriver. My hands moved through the intricate maze of smoking gears, completely ignoring the blistering heat of the metal casing. I found the primary synchronization bracket. With 3 rapid, hyper-precise adjustments, I realigned the warped rotational axis, manually compensating for the thermal expansion. I stepped back and hit the manual override switch. The horrific, grinding metal screech instantly vanished. The high-frequency vibration returned, purring with a flawless, heartbeat-like rhythm. The warning alarms silenced, and the monitors switched from flashing red back to a stable, tranquil green. The prototype was saved. For a moment, the $50 million testing lab was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then Trent's panicked voice shattered the silence. "He got lucky," Trent shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my faded maintenance uniform. "He's a glorified janitor! He just banged on the casing and got a lucky break! Security, arrest this filthy trespasser!" I slowly turned away from the humming machine and locked eyes with the desperate project manager. "It wasn't luck, Trent," I said, my voice cutting through the room with lethal, icy authority. "And I didn't bang on the casing. I recalibrated the primary axis by exactly 0.2 millimeters to compensate for the fact that you replaced the aerospace-grade tungsten gears with substandard commercial aluminum." Trent went completely pale. You're lying!" "Aluminum has a thermal expansion coefficient of 23.1. I continued, stepping toward him, reciting the physics from pure, dormant memory. Under a maximum capacity stress test, those cheap gears warped, completely destroying the microscopic synchronization. You deliberately swapped the materials to skim millions off the R&D budget, perfectly willing to let this pediatric medical device fail and potentially kill children just to line your own pockets. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Trent screamed, backing away. "You're a nobody wearing a piece of plastic trash." Before I could answer, the silver-haired lead investor pushed past Sloane. He was staring at me, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at my grease-stained face, then down at the flawless micro-adjustments I had just made inside the chamber. "My God," the investor whispered, his voice trembling with absolute shock. "It's you. You're Elias Vance, the original chief architect." You wrote the foundational theory for this entire technology 5 years ago before you vanished. The blood completely drained from Trent's face. The security guards didn't need another order. They grabbed the corrupt project manager by his expensive suit and dragged him out of the lab, his pathetic excuses echoing down the hallway. The investor quickly followed, urgently calling the police to report the embezzlement. Suddenly, the sprawling glass laboratory was empty, leaving only me and the billionaire CEO. Sloane was trembling. Her untouchable, arrogant facade had been entirely obliterated. She slowly walked toward me, staring at the flawless humming machine, and then her eyes dropped to the cracked, brightly colored superhero watch on my wrist. "You're a genius," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You created this. Why? Why would a man like you throw it all away to sweep floors? Why do you wear that $5 piece of trash?" I looked down at the cracked plastic face because 4 years ago, my wife bought this for our son's 3rd birthday. I said softly, the anger leaving me, replaced only by a heavy, familiar ache. She was killed by a drunk driver on her way home. The watch survived the crash, but the face was cracked. And the alarm that offended you so deeply in your boardroom, goes off every day at exactly 3:15 p.m. That is the exact minute the trauma surgeon told me her heart had permanently stopped. Sloane stopped breathing. "It's my daily reminder," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. A reminder that all the money, all the prestige, and all the $50 million boardrooms in the world mean absolutely nothing if you aren't there for the people you love. I gave up my career so I would never, ever be late to pick up my son. Sloane stared at me, the devastating weight of what she had done crashing down on her. She looked at the cheap plastic watch, then at the tears welling in my tired eyes. Slowly, the Ice Queen shattered. Her knees buckled. The billionaire CEO collapsed onto the cold laboratory floor, burying her face in her trembling hands. She began to weep deep, agonizing sobs of absolute shame and overwhelming remorse. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I'm so sorry. I called it trash. I called you a nobody. I'm so sorry." I didn't take the corner office, and I certainly didn't accept the massive, multi-million-dollar executive contract Sloane frantically tried to draft for me the next morning. Corporate prestige was the exact suffocating cage I had escaped, and I was never going back inside. Instead, I agreed to return as the firm's independent lead consultant. The compensation was more than enough to secure Leo's future, but the terms were entirely my own. My contract had one absolute non-negotiable clause. No meetings, under any circumstances, are to be scheduled after 3 p.m. Sloane changed after that day. The cold, untouchable billionaire slowly traded her heavy armor for something real. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she showed up at our local neighborhood park, wearing simple jeans and a faded sweater. She brought 2 melting ice cream cones, sat on the grass, and just watched Leo and me kick a soccer ball around. For the first time in her life, the billionaire was finally learning how to breathe. Society is often incredibly quick to measure a man's absolute worth by the brand of the watch on his wrist, the car he drives, or the tailored suit he wears. The elite, like Sloane, often blindly believe that expensive, glittering possessions are what truly create human dignity and command respect. But they fail to realize that sometimes a cheap, cracked plastic watch carries the crushing weight of an entire human life and the profound, immeasurable sacrifice of a grieving father. We navigate a world obsessed with surface-level wealth, completely ignoring the quiet heroes sweeping the floors and working in the shadows. Trent chose pure, ruthless greed, believing his expensive suits made him invincible, and he ultimately reaped the cold reality of a federal prison cell. Sloane chose a cruel, superficial judgment and nearly watched her life's work burn to ashes. But Elias chose to swallow his pride, lowering his ego to protect the innocent lives that his brilliant mind could save. True, absolute value is never determined by the price tag permanently attached to the objects you own. It is measured entirely by the profound sacrifices you are willing to make for the people you love. While this specific narrative is a work of fiction, it reflects the very real, unseen sacrifices that single parents make every single day. If you truly believe that a father's love and sacrifice are absolutely priceless, please type the word value in the comments below. Or share a personal experience about a time you were unfairly judged simply by your appearance. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply emotional stories.